We're here tonight for an event called Racially Restrictive Covenants in the Wayzata and Plymouth Neighborhoods, Part 2. I'll share my screen here. So one moment. Okay. We'll go till 7 o'clock sharp tonight. We won't run over, and really excited to be here this evening. So tonight's program is going to be a quick recap introduction to covenants. And we provided that introduction at the May 13th event. We'll just do a quick recap tonight. The May 13th event is recorded and available through Wayzata Community Ed. And then we'll cover how covenants intersected with some other government policies. We'll talk about the Minnesota paradox. We'll also talk about current policies and practices with exclusionary results. And then we'll wrap everything up tonight with a summary of the Just Deeds Coalition. Before we dig into the program and introduce our speakers tonight, I just did want to start by thanking the community organizations that made this event possible. It's really important that events like this are a collaboration between community members, and that's definitely what we saw here. Wayzata Community Ed, of course, the League of Women Voters in this area, the Interfaith Outreach and Community Partners, Citizens for Racial Equity, Unitarian Universalist Church of Minnetonka, and Just Deeds in City of Wayzata. Thank you. I'm Emily Gellner. I'm a certified city planner, and I co-chair the Diversity and Equity Committee for the American Planning Association, and I'm also the Community Development Director for the City of Wayzata.
Hi, my name is Kiara Zachary. I am the Equity and Inclusion Manager for the City of Golden Valley, and I am also in the leadership circle for the Just Deeds Coalition.
Thank you, Kiara. Excited to speak with you tonight. Kiara and I were the speakers for the last one, and yes, when we prep for events, we could just talk for hours. So we have to cut ourselves off. We have a lot we can talk about. So really happy to be here with you tonight. So let's dive right in. Let's do it.
All right. So this is a part of our recap, and this is why we are here. The title of our event tonight is Racially Restrictive Covenants in the Wayzata and Plymouth Neighborhoods, and this is an example of that. So here is a language from a covenant found on a property deed or the ownership papers for a home or land that restrict and prohibit the occupation, lease, or sale of that land to anyone of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. And we've recognized, as we discussed, that this practice has perpetuated and has lasting impacts that we still see today in regards to our housing gap and our home ownership gap and affordability. And this is sort of foundational to all of that. So this is why we're here. This is what we're talking about today, is really how structural racism in housing has really facilitated and maintained structural racism in a number of different areas still today. Here's a map of mapping prejudice that outlines where these covenants happened, and we discussed this in our first event as well. This is a time lapse, so starting in 1910, that's the earliest that we found. It's the earliest found covenant in the metropolitan area in the, Twin Cities in Minneapolis. And as we see that they start to grow and expand as a practice throughout the Twin Cities and neighboring suburbs, you'll also see that, in that West Metro also had covenants within those neighborhoods. Most particularly, what we want to draw attention to is that there's a border around the city of Minneapolis, which really maintained where folks were allowed to be and how we see concentrations of poverty and concentrations of specific populations that are still lasting. Next slide.
So I just wanted to include an acknowledgement here that Kevin Ehrman Solberg passed away over the weekend. He was a co-founder and the digital and geospatial director for Mapping Prejudice. He contributed a lot to this project, and he died at the age of 33 very suddenly. So we want to make sure that we're acknowledging him here in his work with mapping prejudice.
The time-lapse map that we just saw was an example of Kevin's work and contribution to our fight against structural racism. So.
So we also do have a map that is more local. You saw this at the last event, but just wanted to get it in front of your eyes once more. The Highlands neighborhood and the Holdrich neighborhoods here in Wayzata, along with a few other properties. There were ads put in the paper at the time that these lots were carefully restricted. I think that what's interesting here is just that the word race wasn't used. And so there was definitely a common understanding among people that restriction was by race. And then in the Plymouth neighborhoods, we don't have as much of a developed map, but we do know that it's in the Vicksburg-Gleason area, Medicine Lake Drive, and then the Sunset Trail, Ridgemount Avenue area. And the Mapping Prejudice website, you can zoom in and see very closely which parcels have the covenants on them as well.
And so while what we've seen thus far is really talking about developers, most specifically inserting racially restrictive covenants into lands that the land that they were developing and the plots that they were selling, this comes from the City of Golden Valley minutes. And so this is just to show that local government, our cities were also not just complicit by just letting it happen, but active within the construction of the system. So here we have minutes that says, yep, we're going to have this land be developed, and it is understood that the above restrictions are embodied in general deed and filed in register. So we needed to have these restrictions in order to develop this land, and it is the racially restrictive covenant that would be applied to all of the plats and that would be subdivided is listed here near letter G. What's also interesting, and we'll touch on this more later in the presentation, is that at the time, cities did not have zoning code. And essentially, just literally a couple years after this, the City of Golden Valley developed their first zoning code and all of the ordinances that went along with that. We took everything A through J, and that's what created the zoning code, right? Once racially restrictive covenants were outlawed, we took G out, but we kept everything else A through J, and that became our zoning code. And there are implications, and we'll talk about them later on today, that still create disparities or a predictability to access living and housing within neighborhoods that have very similar codes or laws, restrictions that are being put upon land and how it can be used and who can stay there.
Yeah, I think this is a good opportunity, Kiara, to also mention that Rebecca at the first event had mentioned that she has a home in Wayzata that had a covenant on it and still has the covenant on it. I think you may have disavowed it already, that talked about only allowing people of color if they're an indentured servant. And the word servant is still in the Wayzata zoning code. So there's still some work that we can all be doing to look through old codes to see what kind of old language is. It's kind of time to reevaluate whether that needs to stay or go.
So this map here is from the National Geographic magazine, and it highlights where the racially restrictive covenants were and in specifically in alignment with redlining. And we discussed this last time. But redlining was a practice that was created by the Federal Housing Association, and it's where they would lend homes, where they would lend in federally backed mortgages. Redlined areas were areas, so the areas that are red were areas that had been designated as having a concentration of BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, and people of color within them. To have federally backed mortgages, you would have to have a green or a blue designation. And so racially restrictive covenants, and this is a wonderful quote here, are not about discriminating against people of color, but it's about enriching white people. So what happens when you don't have the intentional development and the intentional economic development within certain areas through things like homeownership and building of small businesses, and again, backed by the federal government. And then you do have those same economic opportunities in areas that are blue and green lined. So we want to shift the narrative about where the intentionality is. Systemic racism is not just about creating barriers to opportunities and resources for Black and Brown people, but it's also about enriching and creating structures that enrich lives of white folks. So that's what the narrative of what systemic racism really is what we want to sit with in this slide.
So let's jump into the Minnesota paradox. So it's really just not anecdotal that Minnesota is one of the best places to live in the US. There's definitely ways that you can measure what a good life you can have here. But paradoxically, it's also one of the worst places for Black people to live in comparison to opportunities that white people have. So I just want to summarize a few pieces of data that's just encompassing in the Minnesota paradox. All of the data is just chronicling persistent racial disparities that you can find in really almost every measure of quality of life. And I think this can get really heavy. There's a lot of data to support this, and it's really easy to get overwhelmed by the data. It can lead to just a lot of feelings of just guilt and shame and blame. And I think for some people, just kind of apathy at some point. But I just think that this is a really good learning space for us, and that many of us maybe never learned about this in our previous backgrounds, and that's okay. We're doing that now. We see some of the most significant racial gaps in unemployment rates, wage and salary, incomes, incarceration rates, arrest rates, homeownership rates. This is all disparities by race, mortgage lending rates, even test scores of students, school disciplinary and suspension rates, even drowning rates. So African Americans are just worse off in Minnesota than virtually other state in the nation when compared to white residents. And I just bring up too at this point that, this is really relevant to city government. I'm really a proud steward of local governance and good local governance. And the cornerstone of all of our local ordinances is health, safety, and welfare. And that's measured in all kinds of ways. And I think even though we know that local government doesn't affect all of these things directly, our business is quality of life for our residents. And so when we see, these differences in our communities, I wonder how we can make a positive influence. It's clear that governments have had influence in the past. And so thinking that we don't have influence now, I think is an oversight. It's just maybe take some digging and to really find clarity on where that impact can happen. But also what's interesting about all of this data is that it's really just quite a matrix or like a labyrinth of information. All of these things can become interconnected, and that's why you can become pretty quickly apathetic to it all because it does feel so interwoven that it can become overwhelming. But nonetheless, I do want to share some more information about income. By now you probably read the stats on the screen, but I think it's important to remember that it's been said that wealth begets more wealth. So, having a higher level of wealth just enables greater access to even more credit to build more wealth. It just really provides individuals and families with that financial agency to take risks and have that economic security. It shields against economic loss that can be devastating. another thing that's really unique that I'm not sure everybody totally knows about is that people in the US have primarily built their wealth through homeownership. I think we all have many examples, that we can think of that. And what we've learned through the history of redlining, is that Federal Housing Administration denied homeownership to Black Minnesotans. And even after redlining was no longer practiced and racial covenants became unenforceable, there were other policies in practice that ensured that segregation continued. And we found that even the buying power of Black families was not really where the buying power was for white families, even after the Fair Housing Act. The homeownership rates are drastically different in Minnesota, and it is the strongest disparity in the entire country. Minneapolis specifically has the lowest African American homeownership rate in the country. And we just have to remember that families amass their wealth primarily through property ownership. So the longer you read about this topic, you start to realize that the home ownership gap is the wealth gap, and the wealth gap is the home ownership gap. They really work one and the same. And there's many articles and books to support that notion. Another thing that is really quite recent still is what happened with the foreclosure crisis in 2007, 2008. People of color were really targeted for risky subprime loans. And so that had a really drastic effect on the homeownership rate as well. This graph, I think, is really important to note that more than 1 in 4 Black households have zero or negative net worth. And, you think of how many white families have no net worth. That's only 1 in 10 white families, as opposed to 1 in 4 Black families. So I think the really popular narrative that we've been working with for many decades is that there's all of these kind of individual and family circumstances that lead to having no wealth, and that it's, personal choices were made, or, family makeup was a certain way. But what really is the history is that there were government policies and systemic issues at play. You can take out the factors that are commonly used to explain the wealth gap, like age of people in the house, their earning potential in that sense, their household structure, their education level, even their current income or their occupation. You can take all that into account, and really the raw differences between wealth persist by race. So I think that's really important, that people really build equity through their home. And again, the racial wealth gap is the home ownership gap.
I just wanted to add one more thing here too,
Yeah,
Emily,
sure.
is because the other thing that we have to recognize is that there's a catch up to be played, right? Or a catch up to be made. And so when we're talking about, Fair Housing Act, and we're talking about racially restrictive covenants no longer being enforceable and redlining no longer being enforceable, that's just 2 generations ago. We're not talking a super long time. And so we've had families, there are white families who've been accumulating wealth for 10, 12 generations, right? And now we have this gap, and the expectation is that, well, now in 2 generations, there should be some sort of fixing. So when we're thinking about structurally, even if we had, sorry, it's my 4-year-old. Even if we had the opportunities, and even if all systems, which we still know there's work to do with our systems, even if all systems allowed for equal access to opportunities and resources, at this point, we're measuring gaps based on right now, and without the ability to accumulate over time, that we have to catch up. We have to not only think about equality, but in this case, equity, and not talking about home ownership equity, but equity meaning how do we strategically create systems that allow for the catch up to happen. So that's the what we want to think about as we talk about disparities, we talk about gaps most particularly.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then this map is really interesting because it shows just the regional effect that these policies have had. When we talk about issues that Minneapolis and St. Paul face, I think it's really important that that we in our community out here in the western suburbs realized that that wasn't just something that happened, by natural forces. It was part of government policy that created the economic differences that we do see here. There's just the issues that are faced here is just through, restricted neighborhoods and through covenants is we saw that it was really difficult to get access to well-funded quality education. Wealth accumulation through homeownership and real estate appreciation was very different in these communities. Wealth accumulation through business opportunities was much different and is. Access to stable, well-paying employment, access to quality healthcare, access to environmental healthy space, all the measures of quality of life. And I guess the other interesting thing to note about this map, and I think we might have shown this at the first event, but it's just really powerful and a good reminder of just regionalism in general, is just that the Met Council used to only map concentrated poverty. They never mapped concentrated affluence. And only a few years ago did they start to acknowledge that it's really important to map affluence as well, so we can understand the differences and not using a narrative all the time of, trying to make people who live in poverty seem like they're inherently a problem that needs to be fixed. This is a system that was created that we are all a part of.
And this is how these systems still perpetuate today through a number of current practices that we see that we're listing here. But the first thing is the appraisal disparities. Homes that are almost identical in previously redlined areas appraised for much less than homes that of the same quality and size and same metrics in non-redlined neighborhoods. Moreover, homes that are appraised, and there's a recent phenomenon being studied, is that homes that appear to be owned by a BIPOC resident appraised for less than homes that appear to be owned by white residents. There was a recent news story of a family who had 3 different appraisers come in. When they came and visited the home for the first 2 times, their home appraised for less than their neighbor's home, and they wondered why. They had maintained their home in the same way as their neighbors. They had, very similar metrics as their neighbors, same size lot, same size home, same number of bedrooms, and all of those things. And literally on the 3rd time, they switched, a neighbor stepped in for them, for this Black couple. I believe it was a southern city. And their home appraised, for $60,000 more and was on par with the rest of the neighbors, with the rest of the homes in the neighborhood. So there's a disparity and a predictability to how homes are being appraised and what that means. So when we're talking especially about wealth appreciation and accumulation, if the only, if where most folks can afford homes, or if the homes that are most affordable are in neighborhoods and they're not being appraised equally, they're not going to appreciate and they're not going to accumulate wealth through home ownership in those same ways. Real estate steering, right? So realtors, directing people towards neighborhoods that were previously not redlined, and they use language like safer communities, or they use language, or they say, oh, well, the schools are really good here, and they use great school ratings, and they steer folks out of certain neighborhoods and they steer them into certain neighborhoods. Lending discrimination. We talk about lending discrimination in regards to who gets accepted, or whose real estate or mortgage application gets accepted and whose does not, who gets declined. And that there's even a gap in that point. So once folks are ready and they feel ready to purchase a home, that they are still denied access to home ownership, because Minnesota has one of the largest gaps when it comes to mortgage origination rates and who gets declined and who gets denied from those things. Emily already spoke about the foreclosure crisis and how predatory lending really impacted home ownership rates in the BIPOC community. But then, so what's these next 4 bullet points are really about, you know, things that, so these the first 4 are more of how are the system playing really against and how these barriers are erected to home ownership. But the next 4 are really talking about, again, how are we enriching the lives of folks who already have access to home ownership and wealth accumulation. So, you know, things like your federal tax credit policies, how you get tax credits for your mortgage interest deductions, how you get tax credits. There were tax credits for home buying and all these types of things before. Infrastructure and park investments, what you're able to do with property taxes, and how you're able to maintain green space, have green space and parks for you to be able to exercise in, what that really means for your community health-wise, your infrastructure, your streets and the width of those streets and maintaining those things, how you're able to maintain safety walking spaces or bike lanes and all of those things to create easy transport and healthy and to, why can't I think of this word? I'm sorry. Engage in a healthier lifestyle. Neighborhood and school segregation. And what we see here oftentimes is that folks are still living in those same areas, those same red line areas. And while we would think that folks would like to move, and that once we said you can move and do and go anywhere, that folks would do so. But by the time, and we have to think about this very critically, by the time that all of these things happened, again, we had already created this disparity and we had already created barriers to accessing certain neighborhoods. So what we see right now is that our neighborhoods are still segregated because folks are going to live really where they can afford to live. But in turn, if our neighborhoods are segregated, so are our schools. So our funding policies for schools, how we fund our schools, how we even draw district lines and who goes where, right? I used to work for Robbinsdale area schools, and for a school district that is as diverse as Robbinsdale area schools is, with basically half of their students, between 55 and 60% of their students associating as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, there are schools that are 85 to 90% white. And then there are schools that are 85 to 90% BIPOC within the same district, right? And so because of how the neighborhoods are within the district, we see school segregation in the same, again, in the same sort of like 7-city radius. And so that's how our current practices also perpetuate and maintain systems of racism. Oh, this is one of my favorite graphs here, or maps. So National Geographic did some research on the heat island effect in formerly red-lined areas. And the heat island effect basically measures the temperature in neighborhoods and geographically how temperature and weather impact specific neighborhoods. And so what we see is the red line map, which we've already looked at for the city of Minneapolis, and the areas that are red line there are neighborhoods where federally backed mortgages were not allowed through the FHA. Those neighborhoods were hotter by up to 10 degrees sometimes than neighborhoods that formerly had racially restrictive covenants. In addition to being hotter and all of the implications of having a hotter neighborhood, we saw higher instances of things like diabetes, fewer areas for green space and exercise. We saw higher instances of asthma, shorter life expectancy, and a number of other health implications related to space. We also recognized that these neighborhoods, because of the lack of economic development, had food deserts in almost the exact same places. Food deserts are areas where there aren't grocery stores, so fully functional grocery stores in every neighborhood within a 1.5 mile radius. So you should be able to get to a fully functional grocery store within a 1.5 mile radius. So there are folks with limited transportation that can't get to a grocery store. Right now, all of North Minneapolis has 3 grocery stores for half of the city. That's not the case in South Minneapolis and in other places, right? And really one of them is a smaller grocery store. It's an Aldi, so it's not a full grocery store, but folks count it because you can get most of what you need there. So again, when we think about structural racism as not just creating barriers to accessing resources and opportunities that can be measured by all of those life outcomes that Emily was talking about, we're also thinking about the intentional enriching, how the use of green space, how the use of more permeable surfaces, how the use of even having more trees, lining trees in certain areas, how those structures, how that infrastructure allows for better health indicators in those communities. And conversely, when we don't do those things, we exacerbate all of the issues that the lack of infrastructure, so the lack of economic development, already created.
Yeah, and I think that, while we're talking about health too, I think it's a good opportunity to just remind people that COVID-19 affected people of color much, much differently. The stats back in August of last year were that, Black and Hispanic Minnesotans, they were accounting for about 20% of the confirmed cases last August, but they only make up 5-6% of the population. 3 times is more likely to contract COVID-19. And that's not, that data is not based on that narrative of like personal choices. This has a lot to do with the type of employment that people are in, proximity of, if they live in close proximity to others, all kinds of different factors are at play there. So this is a good opportunity to just remind people again, I think we talked about this last time, but the racial covenants and all of that happened, before there was really barely any diversity in the Twin Cities area, in terms of what we see today and what we'll see in the future. It seems like a lot of effort was put into exclusionary practices when we were a very, very majority white population. The trend is of course changing, but it makes you wonder, how will we pivot in the future as we see our demographics changing? Just a reminder that just because we may be eventually a majority non-white population in our country does not guarantee justice for people. We have examples all around the world, South Africa being a good one, of the fact that we have to be very intentional about new practices in order to reverse what has happened. And you've maybe already watched Jim Crow of the North, the documentary about this topic, but there is one particular part of Jim Crow of the North that I really like to mention here. And that's just that Dr. Brittany Lewis is a really, really smart doctor in Minneapolis and a professor. And she's really talking about how mapping prejudice is naming something and acknowledging history that really was in the shadow of politics and planning for many years. The point of these graphs and these maps are to just get people to read them, just to get people to understand that all of this is here it gives context to the things you're reading on the front page of the newspaper when you may feel like you've got your mind made up, but there's a lot of data to support why we are where we are. The point of this is to just change the narrative from these personal and cultural pathologies to explain these differences that we see in quality of life and point out how the systems that we built create the outcomes. So the covenants really laid the groundwork for the later manifestations of policies that follow in city planning in many other ways. And the thing that she points out that I find is really profound in the documentary is just that space and urban planning is just so much more than buildings, and it really is about people's lives and their humanity. And the fact that we have vast differences in life expectancy is something that we all should be paying attention to and caring about. That urban planning is about people and their lives, and our values as a society are built into our systems and our policies. So how will we learn and grow and have our values come through in our policies today? Is there anything else you wanted to say, Kiara, about that slide, or should I keep going with this one?
I had something, but you just wrapped it up so wonderfully. So go right ahead.
Okay, well, if it comes back around, you say that thing. I like to include this slide when we talk about the Minnesota paradox, because I didn't even list all the data. There's way too much data to even go into it at one time. I think it's really important that, you may read some of this type of information or even this presentation and just feel depleted and just offended and guilty and even apathetic. But I really want you to walk away just feeling like new and like a fresh perspective, that you can ask big questions and use this as a context for finding ways in your own personal journey and personal learning journey, your learning journey with your family and your friends and your organization you work for and the other community groups that you're a part of, to just bring this in. And all of this information is not meant to point fingers. It's actually meant to bring us all into the same circle and for us to grow that circle bigger and help other people understand what we know and share that knowledge. But there's just this part, I think, that's really where we get stuck, is probably on the, if you're starting at the top of the screen, it's probably that third one, the emotional response. It's just really easy to forget that we're all human and to have empathy and compassion for one another. And if we can get through that piece, we continue moving through this cycle so that we can move into a cycle of action and not inaction. And this is work that we're going to do every day. And we go through this cycle and get stuck in this cycle at different topics and different ways people say things to us or ways people point out these things that we're dealing with. But I find that this is just showing loving wisdom and trying to just do the best we can do and do the hard work that really is necessary of us all as community members and as humans to look out for one another.
We're going to pause for reflection. But I think often, and one of my favorite authors about this work is Bell Hooks, and she has a trilogy of books. She's a sociologist, and she has a trilogy of books called All About Love. And the first one is really talking about, personal love, the love that you would have for other people in relationships, and that's wonderful and beautiful in and of itself. It definitely has helped me in my life. But the second book is really about the social love and how that is the unconditional love that is mentioned in that circle of action, and how we have that. And really what Hooks talks about is what Emily says, is when our values match our structures and our system, when we start to act like we care that someone that lives on the other side of a highway, or that someone that lives 10 miles from us has a shorter life expectancy due to infrastructure and infrastructure alone. What does that mean? What does that love really look like then? And what are we willing to do to express and show that love, right? And it's that sort of, that's how you get over that apathy and that sort of that you know, that initial emotional response and that overwhelming and moving into that action. And so this is where I think it's important that we find agency, and this is kind of what we're going to pause and think about right now. This is really important, is that the action piece, right? What are we going to do is what snaps us out of our apathy and reminds us of our work and fight for liberation. That exercise is what Bell Hooks calls unconditional love. And so we're gonna work on that right now. So we're gonna take a minute just to think, just to process, because we recognize that it's a lot. So the first thing is like, what do we notice, right? What are we, out of everything that we have gone over thus far, what are you noticing about this material? Your wonderings are your questions. What questions do you have? What do you want to know some more about? What would you research next? Those types of things. And then actions. What are you going to do? What do you feel called or compelled to do in this moment? Knowing what you know, having the questions that you have. So we'll give you a minute for space, and then we'll have one of you share. One brave soul. Folks are starting to turn their cameras back on, so I'm assuming that means they're ready for the next step. Would anyone like to share a noticing, their wonderings, or an action?
It's clear.
I have a thought.
Okay.
Just thinking what a strong role churches are playing in this work, this action you're talking about. I think if anybody belongs to a church that is inactive, that they could check around, and there's some churches. One example is the UCC churches, United Church of Christ, the statewide conference, which is 110 churches all across the state, and 4 of the larger churches in the metro are really making a strong step forward to organize Minnesota Council of Churches, of which UCC is just one member. There's a lot of organizing going on through churches. So I just want to put that out there, that if someone's feeling like, well, what can I do as one person? A lot of one persons can connect to the groups who are doing this, and there's a lot of activity going on.
Thanks, Brad.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Along the same line, the UU Church, the Unitarian Universalist Church, is also doing a lot of things. This past year, we did a lot of reading. I mean, part of it was just really understanding the situation. And so we had reading groups. We read books, Menneken's book, and others, like White Fragility, and a couple others.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to really get on board with where we were personally in our own racism, and how we just kind of lived in our own little world.
I've got things to do, but
Nope.
it's
Sorry. I muted him, Betty. Betty, thank you for bringing that up. I think that that is a really important to remember that white people especially will be on a journey for many years, a personal educational journey. It takes a long time to really let this all settle in. I've been familiar with this information for 10 years and I'm still learning a lot. It takes a really long time to really open up and to really start seeing all of it. And so I'm happy to hear that, you found a group that you feel that you can share that personal journey with, because it's super vulnerable. None of us want to appear like we don't care or that we don't know. So, but hopefully that's these type of community events where we can just share what we're learning is really valuable to you all. And I really appreciate that. I'm a member of the city government, but this was not city government driven. This was driven by community organizations that came together that really care about this. And it's about, collaborating with each other. So hopefully there'll be more events like this in the future. And we have a personal journey, we have a family journey, we have a friend journey, we have an organization journey, we have a community group journey. Like it hits everything in our lives once our eyes start seeing all of this. So thanks for sharing that. We want to talk about Just Deeds, so let's do that.
What I've appreciated about Just Deeds is it's a little action you can learn a lot about and then understand the larger implications. So I'm really appreciative of all that you've done. And so Kate Flom, she's on this call. I'll speak for her. She's our fearless, incredible leader, drafted an email to all our Plymouth and Wayzata residents, church members who are residents of those cities, to contact their city governments to become part of Just Deeds. So to me, it's like, what other action steps can we take? And learning about Just Deeds is one. Next, contact our city government and tell them we need action from you too to join Just Deeds. So anyway, steps like that. I'm thrilled to be able to be part of.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for that very nice transition, Beth. That was right on time. And so we have a number of actions, and I think that Brad really spoke to it wonderfully, is that if you, we are, the organizing and the collective action, individuals taking a collective action to dismantle systemic racism is really at the cornerstone of Just Deeds' mission. So Just Deeds is a coalition of both public and private entities that are working towards dismantling discrimination in housing and educating the community. And, we see ourselves very much in our infancy, but right now our coalition, we have about 11 cities and more cities starting to join, and a number of different organizations and both public and private that are starting to join. But we are here with the community group. And so our time today is going to be focused on what you all can do. And that learning, that personal learning, again, Emily mentioned, it's your family learning, it's your organizational learning, whether that's your workplace or your community group, your church, your neighborhood group. It's really researching the history of discriminatory covenants in whatever your locality is. You can participate in the Just Deeds Coalition, of course, and you can educate your community and policymakers about discriminatory covenants and their legacy. That's really important too. This work, I think folks are like, oh yeah, I knew about redlining, or oh, I knew about this, but seeing the language, being very prescriptive and very specific does something different, especially on your own property. It's important to also take an equity lens or apply, 5 core tenets of things like critical race theory to your work and to your volunteering. In what ways are we centering our values and aligning them with anti-racism? And again, understanding that equality just means, yep, it's open for everybody, but really thinking about equity. How are we creating specific tools and resources to dismantling and providing opportunities that have been historically unavailable to people. Lastly, is thinking really deeply. So Emily just spoke about some of the language that's still in the Wayzata Code, but where are your city policies that are perpetuating the legacy of discriminatory covenants in your city, and then recommend changes to those policies. And you may not have the answer. You may not have this is what you do instead yet. Hopefully through your research, you may find some. But continue to work and leverage your individual voice with a bunch of others that say, we recognize and notice this within within our zoning code, or when we talk about affordable housing in our council meetings, that there is a certain narrative that we can overcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kiara, I went and fact checked myself because I was like, does it really say servant? It says people employed in the house. And just like that, so that might not offend someone to hear a zoning code say that, like, you can have someone employed in your house, but I just still wonder, like, where's the origin of that? And sometimes it's not always about a language change. Sometimes it's about just like having a talk about how that zoning code got written. There's a lot of work the City Planning Association would like to do on this work as well, related to zoning codes.
Yeah, so what is Just Deeds and its history? Just Deeds is the name of a project that was launched by the Golden Valley Human Rights Commission. And it is a process. The project helps property owners renounce discriminatory covenants on their property titles. Again, Just Deeds is also a coalition of community groups that are interested in doing this work. And the project is implemented through Minnesota cities and the real estate community, and we're adding community groups to that as well, mainly because we find that it's going to take an interdisciplinary approach across industries, because that's how it originated, right? So we saw that there were developers, that there were real estate agents, that there were cities, all working jointly to create and maintain the system. That means that they're all going to have to work jointly together in order to dismantle the system. And so essentially what Just Deeds does currently is it helps provide free legal and title services for property owners to identify discriminatory covenants and then discharge them. And we also, again, provide educational opportunities for communities in local government too. We've spoken with human rights commissions in various cities. We've spoken to city, provided presentations at city council meetings and other groups as well. The founding members of Just Deeds are the City of Golden Valley, Edina Realty Title, the Minneapolis Area of Realtors, Mapping Prejudice, which we talked about with the maps, and the Minnesota Association of City Attorneys. So again, it's really creating an interdisciplinary and a cross-industry approach to dismantling systems of racism, specifically in housing. So our goal is really to educate Minnesota about practices perpetuated by, like I said, developers, real estate agents, lawyers, local, state, and federal government that establish segregated housing. We want to educate Minnesotans, not just in really changing the narrative about historical disenfranchisement, but then also historic, like the benefit from it, how it was that we didn't just disenfranchise one set of folks, but we really created a system that would allow for the flourishment of another set of folks through homeownership and wealth accumulation. And then lastly, we want to provide an opportunity for folks to take action, whether that's individual through the discharge of your deed or collectively to dismantle racist systems that perpetuate inequality, and devoting resources in any, in the very general term that it is, any sorts of resources to creating equity for communities of color. And so what's interesting is that since we are still in our infancy as a coalition, there isn't a very formal process to joining the Just Deeds Coalition. If maybe your church or your community group want to, it's not very, it's not there's not a formalized process. More so you just talk to someone and start figuring out how you can commit to these 4 things in our mission statement. So just asking the questions, how will you engage and communicate conversations about race and housing? How does, committing to analyze how systemic racism plays out in your community, identifying anti-racist actions within your community that you all can take. And you can also engage your city's Human Rights Commission or your city council in some ways. So whether it's, an entire city or if it's a community group, that there are actions that you can take. And then this is all you would need to do to formally commit to Just Deeds. And then when we say dedicating resources, if it's a city in particular, it's really, dedicating staff time to creating an infrastructure to allow to discharge deeds, but it's also, joining Just Deeds and collaborating with other cities, learning what they're doing and regarding pushing forward racial equity within housing and other economic development opportunities through city government. So it's an opportunity to collaborate. And then that's just specifically for city government. But again, we have opportunities. Like I said, we're starting to grow and learn with, we're starting to grow into different community organizations and also with, different developers and realtors and a bunch of different groups. So clearly that'll look different for everyone. So for the Just Deeds, the expectation is that you would dedicate resources to the Just Deeds mission, again, by helping discharge covenants. You could do like some of the groups have done today, publicize an opportunity to have and facilitate educational opportunities. You can dedicate resources to pair opportunities for property owners and volunteer attorneys, and then assist property owners in rejecting their covenants is how cities can help and what others can do or facilitate within their community groups. And I think that's it. Yes, if you have questions, feel free to contact us at info@justdeeds. You can follow us on all of our social media platforms and visit our website for more information.